Next speaker is Professor Tim Naish, who's got a very interesting background. He's also from Victoria University, Program Leader Ice Ocean Atmosphere for Antarctic New Zealand, Group Co-Leader of Past Antarctic Ice Sheets, part of Cambridge University, New Zealand Sea Rise Program Leader, and a whole lot of other expertise. So he's going to talk about what happens in the ocean and coastline. We've heard about the air, the atmosphere. Now we're going down onto the water. So Tim, over to you.
Yeah, kia ora koutou, katoa people. I'm just aware that James is now the host of this meeting, Phil, and I'm not sure if you're listening, James, but I think he's got control over the screen. Thanks, mate. All right, so you need to give me hosting rights, James, if I'm going to be able to show any slides. Yep.
No, Tristan's the host now, so hopefully you'll
get
some joy very soon.
I still don't have joy. Well, I have joy in my heart, but not joy with my slides. Yeah.
Well, I've lost the joy, so I can't help you. I'd love to be able to, but sorry.
Yeah.
There we go. Tim Naish is the host now.
Right, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you are all seeing Parliament flooded. Can you see that? Oh, here we go. Are you seeing the beehive? Great. Okay, I'll put it on full screen. And am I in the right presenter view, or do I need to flip them?
Yeah, flip it, Tim.
Thanks, mate. How's that?
Yep, great.
Okay, we're all good. All right. Yeah, look, great. Thanks, Phil, for the invite. Great to be here. James has nicely set the scene without slides, because he's such a good speaker, and that's why he got the Prime Minister's Science Prize in Communication. So he set the scene in a great way about the potential climate impacts for New Zealand. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications and the implications for adaptation for New Zealand, and with specifically focusing on the ocean, but specifically on sea level rise. So you can see here what a world might look like with 1.5 meters of sea level rise. The fact that Parliament is there is not a mistake. And I want to just talk about legislation. So this is potentially my most boring slide, but potentially also my most important slide. And the people in the audience tonight will be aware that a lot is happening around climate change legislation. And of course, we had the Carbon Zero Act, in which New Zealand agreed that we would get to carbon zero by 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement. It also set up a thing called the New Zealand Climate Change Commission, of which James is a commissioner, and that is has given us some pathways to get there, which led to an emissions reduction plan that was launched this year, which James talked about. One of the instruments in terms of getting there is the emissions trading scheme, to try and provide a way in which New Zealand can decarbonise its economy and incentivise that. If you deal with large amounts of capital, you now have to declare your disclosure. We have to disclose your exposure to climate change on your financial and business activities, and that's part of the Financial Sector Act. But perhaps the biggest thing and most important thing that is going to influence councils such as the Timaru District Council is the reforms to the Resource Management Act. And this is going to really put some legislative teeth into how we move quickly to adapting appropriately to the impacts that are coming down the line with climate change. And there'll be the Climate Adaptation Act. That'll look at things like managed retreat. Who pays if we have to move away from flood zones? How will that work? And there are other acts in that are important. So recently we went through a national process of climate change risk assessment, and I think we're going to hear more about that from Pete Cochrane for the Canterbury region. But what it showed is that New Zealand is really quite woefully prepared in terms of our understanding of the climate risk and what we are actually going to have to adapt to. So the National Adaptation Plan has made that really clear. And whether it's heat waves, whether it's droughts, whether it's floods, whether it's sea level rise, at the granular level where it affects a community like Timaru, we are still a little bit in the dark in what we're preparing for. So I'm going to present to you how sea level rise will potentially impact New Zealand. I'm going to present a new tool that we have recently developed and put out there for councils and individuals and communities to use in terms of anticipating what might be happening near them on the coastline. So very quickly, sea level is rising, and it's the largest impact globally to date in response to climate change. We've had 20 centimetres of sea level rise. We know that because we have a network of tide gauges around the world that measure that. We have satellite information in the last 30 years, and it's very, very clear we've had 20 centimetres of sea level rise, and that rate is accelerating. So currently sea level's rising at about 3.7 millimetres per year. A third of that has come from what James talked about, the heating of the ocean. All that heat from global warming has gone into the ocean. When you heat water, it expands. That causes sea level rise. 2/3 of it has come from the melting of the glaciers, such as the Southern Alps, the Himalayas, the Andes, and the polar ice sheets. And unfortunately, the polar ice sheets have an enormous amount of water locked up in them, and they are beginning to accelerate in terms of their contribution to sea level rise. So 20 centimetres doesn't sound a lot, but it actually makes a big difference if you put a storm on top of it. And we'll come back to storm surge in a moment. An example would be Hurricane Sandy that hit New York City. Without sea level rise, that's because of that 20 centimetres of sea level rise, that added an additional $3 billion to the damage that happened when Hurricane Sandy hit. What's going on? There we go. Okay, so the challenge of predicting sea level rise, or in the scientific terms, we call it projecting sea level rise into the future. There's two big issues. There's two big questions that we have to try and understand and get our heads around as, in terms of how we will adapt to it. And one of the big wild cards in all of this is how will this enormous chunk of ice that sits over the south pole of our planet in Antarctica respond to climate change? It's melting now. As I said, it's melting at an accelerating rate. And if it all melted, we would end up with 60 metres of sea level rise globally. So it has the potential to contribute massive sea level rise. That's not going to happen in the coming decades and century, but it is melting fast, and we really need to know how it will contribute in the coming decades and centuries. And the science on this remains uncertainty. It's a thing we call, I've just admitted you, Bronwyn. Hopefully you're in. I think I might have the control. Yep, there's Bronwyn, that's great. So one of the things that affects our ability to predict future sea level rise is how the Antarctic ice sheet will respond. And this was articulated in the latest IPCC report that James and Bronwyn have contributed to. And the bottom line is, we're expecting, depending on which carbon future we have, we're expecting up to 1 metre of sea level rise. However, if some of the processes we know that affect the Antarctic ice sheet play out in the near future, we may end up with up to 2 metres of sea level rise. And this led the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to say you cannot rule out 2 metres of sea level rise by 2100. Although considered unlikely and low confidence, we don't understand the processes affecting the Antarctic ice sheet well enough. So this presents a real dilemma for practitioners who are putting in place plans to adapt to climate change. Do you plan for 1 metre? Do you plan for 2 metres? And I'll come back to this. And so the IPCC report for the first time said, we're not going to give you the sort of conservative, well-known projections. We're also going to tell you that the system's unpredictable and there could be a future that's a bit, well, significantly worse if it plays out. So that's the Antarctic ice sheet. We're putting a lot of work into it globally. The science community's trying to bring down those uncertainties. Now, there's another issue with the Antarctic ice sheet, and I just need to go back a slide there and see if I can get this going. Yep. So on the left, oh, they're both going, that's brilliant. On the left, you have a Paris future, a future in which we keep global warming below 2 degrees. And you can see we're up to 2100 and the ice sheet's pretty stable. But on the right, 100 years into the future, we're really melting the West Antarctic ice sheet and contributing to sea level rise. So this is a warming scenario that's a very warm one on the right. This is one in which we achieve the Paris target, which is going to be a significant challenge for the planet to get there. As James says, we still have the power, but that window is closing very much on this future. And what this diagram is showing you, these animations, is that there is a tipping point in the Antarctic ice sheet. It's around about 1.5 to 2 degrees of global warming. And if we go above that, we don't just get a little bit of sea level rise, we get a lot of sea level rise, and we get it for centuries to come, and we cannot stop it because that heat's already in the ocean, it's in the ice sheet. So even if we can bring the CO2 back, we can't reverse some of those changes. Okay, so as James really eloquently said, we still have the power. This is where we want to be by 2100, below 2 degrees of global warming down here on the blue curves. We're actually on the orange curve at the moment, so we're really dicing and messing with that planetary tipping point for the Antarctic ice sheets, because this would be global warming above 2 degrees, and we certainly don't want to end up in this space, which is unabated, unrestricted global warming. Now, so there's two things, right? We don't know how the Antarctic ice sheet's going to respond. We don't know which emissions pathway we'll end up on. And then the third thing, for a place like New Zealand, is local factors matter. And we know this. We live on a plate boundary. We have the Pacific plate going under the Australian plate. It's converging, causes earthquakes. Parts of the country are going up, parts of the country are going down. And the bits in blue here in the central part of New Zealand, Lower North Island, Upper South Island, are subsiding significantly. So that adds to the global sea level rise I talked about from the ocean expansion and the glaciers and the ice sheets. So sea level's going up at 3.5 millimetres per year, but in parts of New Zealand, the coastline is falling at up to 3 to 4 to 5 millimetres per year. So that essentially doubles the rate of sea level rise, the amount of sea level rise, but most importantly, from a planning point of view, it halves the amount of time you have to respond to sea level rise. So right now we have a guidance from the Ministry for the Environment that the local government will be very familiar with in Timaru, and that presents one set of sea level projections for New Zealand. It doesn't take into account the land going up or the land going down, but it does say councils need to be aware of it. So since then, we've been able to measure very accurately with satellite observations from GPS, and of course with our tide gauge records as well, that regional local variation in land movement, and we're now able to factor that in to sea level projections. So you can see here, James and I from the Lower North Island, and we're not in a great spot. These blue, every 2 kilometres around the coast, we've we've got a sea level projection, and these dark blue areas are where the land is sinking at or more than the rate sea level's rising. So what does this mean? If you were using the guidance as it is today, and you were living in Wellington and Petone here, or around by Days Bay, and we've just had this recent storm surge event that this road is highly vulnerable. If you were living in this area and you were using the old guidance, you would think you had till, well, at least 2060 before you got to a critical threshold. And the threshold I'm showing with the red dotted line here is the point at which the 100-year coastal flood or storm surge becomes an annual event, happens every year. So with 30 centimetres of sea level rise in this part of New Zealand, the 100-year coastal flood that we really, shouldn't be seeing more than every 100 years is happening annually. So you would have thought with the old guidance using the one number for New Zealand, you had till at least 2060 or 2055 before that affected you. But if you build in the fact that the land is also sinking while the sea level's rising, you may only have till 2030. So it brings forward the threshold for which nuisance flooding becomes really chronic for a town or a city, in the case of Wellington, by 30 years or more. So this has really, created a bit of a stir since we put this information out. Councils are happy to have the information, but there's also that challenge of how do we incorporate that into our planning for the future. Earthquakes are another problem, and of course in your region and certainly north of your region in Christchurch, earthquakes have been a big part of the picture. So prior to the Christchurch earthquakes, this part of Christchurch, which is South Brighton and South Shore, was sinking at less than 1 millimetre per year. Since the earthquake, it's sinking at 8 millimetres per year. This is the adjustment of the crust to the Christchurch earthquake. We don't know how long it will continue for, but if we factor it into sea level projections, this is what you would have thought you had before the 100-year flood becomes an annual event, maybe 2065. But at the rate at which that part of Christchurch is going down now, they only have till about 2030 before the 100-year flood becomes an annual event. We presented this to Environment Canterbury, and they're very aware of the situation. They've commissioned Tonkin and Taylor to do some detailed work for them. But this is the difference our dynamic coastline makes to sea level projections. So let's come down to your part of the world. This is Timaru, and this is on our website. Suggest you go there. You can dial up Timaru, and every 2 kilometres on the coastline, we've got a little dot there. You click on the dot. Oh, that line's moved, but you click on the dot. It was for this dot here, and you get a sea level projection. And so for Timaru, the story's pretty, it's not as bad. These white dots, these white colours mean the land isn't sinking, the land isn't rising, it's fairly stable. So what Timaru will feel in terms of future sea level rise will be what the world feels. It'll be the global average sea level rise. And what I'm showing here in the orange is a prediction for the future for the climate pathway we're currently on. So this is, if you look around the world at what governments are doing with emissions reduction, this is the pathway we're currently on. And what, for your part of the coastline, what this means is the 100-year event happens annually by about 2050. So you're not as bad as Wellington, but you are going to end up experiencing sea level rise at the rate the rest of the world experiences. Now just remember, 40 centimetres of sea level rise in your area, which you are going to get before the end of the century and potentially as early as 2050. If you put a storm on top of that, that's an additional 3 metres of storm surge, right? So that's what you've got to be thinking about and planning for. You've got a bit more time than other parts of New Zealand. So when we put these projections out to the nation earlier this year, it was wonderful. We had the Prime Minister even comment on it, saying it's not all inevitable. We've still got time if we get in control of our emissions. And that's what James was talking about. We still have time. Globally, we must do it. But the reality is, with sea level rise, it's not all inevitable. We are going to get some sea level rise. And that's because of the heat that's already gone into the ocean, that's already in the ice sheets. We cannot avoid, even if we hit the Paris target, we cannot avoid 0.5 metre of sea level rise by the end of the century. And of course, the fact that some areas, and we've seen a lot of climate impacts in Nelson recently, but in that part of New Zealand, the fact that the land is sinking means that the time frame comes forward, and you don't have as long to prepare and adapt to the impacts of sea level rise. Our new sea level projections have been incorporated into the Coastal Hazards Guidance as an interim guidance. And so councils and users, whether you're in the insurance industry or just public person worried about your holiday home on the coast, you can see how to use these in terms of trying to understand your risk and your exposure to sea level rise. So right now, and I'm wrapping up, I can see I've almost been going 20 minutes. Right now, the world is grappling with, what do we do? What is our capacity to adapt? If you're a rich nation like Japan or Singapore, you can pour concrete and build walls. If you're a poor nation like this little island in the Philippines, you've got no adaptive capacity. You're already looking at loss and damage and inability to live in a place you may have lived for hundreds of years. So New Zealand is dealing with this right now. It's a justice issue. It's an equity issue. It's a fairness issue. And who pays is a massive part of that issue. And all of this will become clearer when we see some of that legislation come into effect. And that will provide the teeth. And I know a lot of councils are waiting to see how the RMA reforms play out and what this means for New Zealand. So my concluding remarks are, as James said, information is power. The future is uncertain, but the science forewarns and forearms. We have time to plan and prepare. It's really important from the regional perspective to take a holistic view of your climate risk, not just building by building, or look at your whole city, look at your whole waterfront, understand all the climate hazards, not just the sea level, but if you're going to get big rainfall events causing river flooding as well, these things can compound on top of each other. In terms of planning, and we haven't had much time to talk about this tonight, you need to remain flexible and adaptive, and don't lock in a pathway that might not play out or might cause you to spend more money than you need to, or might underestimate the risk. And the key for councils is to use this information, but to also monitor with GPS what the land's doing, monitor the tide gauges, and use that information and change your plan of attack for adaptation as you get new information and as it becomes clearer what sort of future we are dealing with. So thank you very much. I will stop there and I'll stop sharing my screen, and hopefully that all went okay with the technology.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think one thing that sort of strikes home to me is a lot of Tim's graphs kept going up, and they hit the edge of the page, and there was no indication that they weren't going to keep going up. Yeah. And that's one of the things I think we need to think about when we're thinking of our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. What we've been looking at is what's going to affect our kids and grandchildren. It's likely to keep going beyond that. So Tim, I think you sort of touched on this. I had a question there. Sea levels are forecast to rise 50 to 80. I put 80 in there. I could get that number wrong. Over the next 50 years, climate change will cause stronger storm surges. Hurricane Katrina caused a storm surge of 8 metres. So as the storm came in, the sea level rose by 8 metres, which is colossal. And the bigger the storm, the bigger the storm surge. So Tim, what's your estimate of how much bigger will the storm surges become around South Canterbury as a result of climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Phil, and thanks, audience, for that question. Yeah, I did touch on it. There's a report out from NIWA, you can go to it. I can put in the chat the place to go, but around about 3 metres would be the storm surge you're dealing with on top of, whatever tide you're at. So it's not 8 metres like Katrina, but it's significant. And I think the point is that the tide rises slowly, and it's a problem. But what we feel and what we must adapt to and what we must protect ourselves from are the extreme events that James was talking about. And so that's the key, knowing what the extreme event will be as a consequence of a small amount of sea level rise.
Thank you very much, Tim. I really appreciate that. So, next slide. So, there's the question here. Now, this was the answer came from the Smithsonian Institute. How much will average sea level rise for each degree of global heating? Now, the issue here is if we get 1 degree of global heating, that degree stays there forever and ever and ever and ever. So the ocean just keeps warming and warming and warming. So over the next 50 years, it might only rise by a small amount. But over hundreds of years or thousands of years, how much is it going to rise? Could I have that question back, that slide back, please? So that's a question for the audience. And if you can get within 50% of the answer that the Smithsonian Institute came up with, you get a hamper. Well, you get some daffodils first. So do we have some ideas as to how much the 1 degree of heating will cause the sea to rise in the long term? Well, eventually it'll stop rising because that heat has brought the ocean up to a temperature consistent with that 1 degree. So eventually, it might be 1,000 years. Come on, some answers. One at the back there. 3 millimetres, inches. 3 metres. Pretty close. 2.5. No. 3.5 at the back. I think 2.3. So yours was 2 down here, wasn't it? Prize to the lady down here, please. 2 metres, 2.3 metres for every degree. Now that's not going to happen overnight. As Tim said, it's going to be 50 metres in the lifetimes of our kids. But long term, it keeps rising. And that's the point of a lot of these graphs. They just go up and up and up. And they get to the end of the page, and we don't think about what happens after that, but they do keep going.